Well, today we are in part two of our series, Shadows. And as I am a pastor, I get to talk to many different kinds of people from many different spiritual backgrounds. And as I talk to people, and I love hearing people's stories, the story I always want to hear from people are the stories of people who tell me, I grew up going to church, and then at some point along the line, I checked out and I stopped going. Or, we never went growing up as a family, but I tried it as an adult, and I just didn't stick. I saw what it was, but I just didn't stick. And now, the reason why I want to hear those stories is because I want to know why people aren't connecting with God through the local church, and I don't want Hope to be a church where it's part of someone's story later on in life, and they say, yeah, I used to go to this church, it was called Hope or something like that, and I don't know, I just didn't stick. So I want to know, what causes people to just kind of drift away from church, to wander away from church? So I always want to hear that story. Never have I heard a theological reason for why people stop going to church. Instead, what I generally hear, you can put it into three categories, essentially. Number one, I just didn't get it. I didn't understand. It didn't make sense to me. I felt like it was over my head. It felt like the priest or the pastor was basically giving the same message every single week, and I just didn't get it. It didn't make sense to me. The second reason that I hear is it didn't meet my expectations. I had expectations of what the church is supposed to do for me, and the church did not meet my expectations, so I stopped going. And the third category I hear is, well, I just wanted to sin instead. Now, nobody says it that way, okay? I just wanted to sin. But what happens in our lives, this is true of all of us, when your behaviors are not in harmony with what you believe, when your behaviors are not in harmony with what your conscience says is right and wrong, that creates a tension, and we begin to avoid the things that remind us what we believe, and church is one of those things. Or if it's not that in the same category, it's someone's past that has shame or regret, and they just don't feel worthy because of their sin, because of their past, because of their shame, of coming into church. Now, as I hear those reasons, there's basically two things going on as I break it down and think about it. Number one, on the one hand, the church, our church, other churches, every church, everybody who's a follower of Jesus is part of the church. The church needs to do a better job of being like Jesus. Because when Jesus lived, people who were irreligious, people who did not go to church, they flocked to him and they were welcomed by him and they felt good in his presence. So we always need to do a better job of being like Jesus, because the church is the body of Jesus, Christians believe. But on the other hand, what I realize when I'm talking with these people is that I'm talking with a person who hasn't encountered God yet. I'm talking with a person who hasn't tasted and seen how good God is. I'm talking to a person who hasn't experienced a glimpse of God's holiness, a glimpse of his glory. They've not experienced the awe and wonder that comes when we bump into and bump up against the greatness and power and glory of God and who he is. Because when we as individuals experience that, it changes our categories. See, when we bump up against God's glory and we begin to encounter him and experience who he really is, you suddenly realize my expectations weren't just miscalibrated, they were much too low. What I expected the church to give me, I encountered God, and it just was so profound, it changed everything and made my expectations look kind of silly. When we encounter the goodness and grace of God and it collides with our shame and our shame and our guilt are crushed beneath the grace and the love of God. And that excuse is absolutely blown away. When we know that we can encounter God both at home through reading the Bible, through meditating on Scripture, through deep prayer, but also in a unique way when the church comes together, you're not going to say, I didn't get anything out of it. You're going to come with anticipation and expectation. I wonder if today we'll get a glimpse of God as the church comes together. So for some of us in the room, that's what I'm describing in your spiritual life. Have you experienced the wonder of meeting God? Have you encountered him? Have you gotten glimpses of his glory? Have you been filled with that awe and that indescribable love in your heart and in your life, deep down in your soul? If not, I am so glad you're here today. Today and for the next 2 weeks, my challenge for you is do not miss. Because we're going to look at some stories from the life of Moses about what it looks like and how we can encounter the true and living God. Which is a challenging thing to do, by the way. And the biblical authors, if you think about what their task was, I mean, what a task to try to describe the infinite, powerful, holy God to finite human hearts and minds and souls. That would be a little bit like trying to explain to my son's guinea pig the heart and the mind and soul of my wife. I can barely grasp what's going on in the heart and mind and soul of my wife. What chance does the guinea pig have? That's kind of what it's like for finite human beings to grasp how amazing God is and actually encounter him. Yet, as we read what the biblical authors wrote, they didn't just use terminology, which is challenging because so much biblical concept and terminology, it doesn't translate into everyday life. Okay, we don't use some biblical ideas in everyday life. You don't say to your boss, hey, I need to redo that report. I sinned when I filled it out the first time, okay? You don't. When you get pulled over for going too fast, the police officer does not say, do you know how fast you were sinning back there? I'm going to need to see your license and repentance. So, okay, we don't use these terms in everyday life, but wherever we have these terms and ideas that are critical to understanding who God is, what I love about the biblical authors is that they poured meaning and significance into these thoughts through illustrations, through narratives, and through real life stories. And in this series, we've been looking at the life story of a man named Moses. And as we've been unpacking his story, we get rich meaning and understanding into some of the most critical ideas about understanding and encountering and meeting God. And today, in the life story of Moses, we are going to discover what it means to be saved. We're going to understand through a story what salvation looks like. Today, to do that, we're going to look at the Red Sea crossing from Exodus chapter 14. Now, this is one of the more famous stories of the Bible. In fact, if you've never read the Bible or if you're new to the Bible, you've probably heard of the idea of the Red Sea crossing and people moving through the sea when it splits in half. But it's impossible to overstate the significance and importance of this story from the life of Moses. In fact, the rest of the biblical authors, because Exodus is only the second book of the Bible and there's many more that follow, the rest of the biblical authors continually looked back at the Red Sea crossing in order to explain this is what salvation looks like. If you want to understand what it means to be saved by God, this is the story you have to understand. In fact, they directly quote the Red Sea crossing over 24 times in the rest of their writings, and they allude to the Red Sea crossing over 100 times. In fact, I believe that everything you need to know about being a Christian is found in this one chapter of the Bible, in the story of a man who lived a long time ago named Moses. This is such an important chapter of the Bible. I come back to it every 3 years or so and talk about it. In fact, several years ago, we even spent 4 weeks on this one chapter of the Bible. That's how important it is. Today, we're going to just spend one day looking at it. For many of you, maybe it will encourage you or inspire you to go home and check it out and study it on your own, read through it at home. I hope you'll do that. But today, we're going to read Exodus chapter 14, and in it, our goal is to discover not just what does it mean to be saved, not just what does it mean to meet God. My goal is that you'll actually meet him. So, we're going to be in Exodus chapter 14, and we're going to begin at verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon." So, let me give you the background. Moses and Aaron had gone to Pharaoh, and they said, let the people go, because the Hebrew people, some 2 million of them, were being held in slavery by an Egyptian dynasty. This became the backbone of the Egyptian economy. Moses and Aaron said, let them go. Pharaoh said no. God sent a series of 10 plagues on the Egyptians. And the 10th plague, the last one, was the Passover. If you missed last week, that's where we talked about this one. God said, my angel will pass through the land, the destroyer, which for many of us totally ruined our mental image of what angels look like and what they do. And he will strike down the firstborn son in every home unless you slaughter a lamb and take shelter beneath its blood, painting its blood over the doorframe of your home. And in every home in Egypt, there is either a dead son or a dead lamb. Now, the whole purpose of that, of course, was to be a foreshadow. It's where we get the name of our series, foreshadowing Christ and how we can take shelter beneath his blood. At that point, Pharaoh said, Moses, get out, take the people with you, take your stuff. I never want to see you again. So they go marching out of Egypt, and God says, here's where I want you to camp. And these names mean absolutely nothing to us, but these were well-known landmarks back then. It would be like saying, hey, where are we going to meet for lunch? Well, go east on I-94, then take the Steinhofels exit. And you're like, gotcha, yep, know exactly where you're talking about. That's all he's saying. These are real people, real locations, real landmarks. Here's what happens. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. So what God is telling Moses to do is a terrible idea. Go to a place where strategically you will be pinned in by a sea, and you will have no escape routes, and Pharaoh will think, I've got him now, they made a mistake. Yes, Moses, you have a question about my plan. Shouldn't we be like at a mountain pass or something where we can defend ourselves while the women and children run away? Nope, go where there's no escape. Yes, Moses, another question. How about at least an open plain so the fast ones can get away and the slow ones will be killed? Nope, you're going to go to a place where you are pinned in, there will be no escape, and I will convince Pharaoh he's got you now, and in his anger, he's going to pursue you. That's my plan. Now, the amazing thing, Moses is such a man of faith, he's like, all right, you're God, let's go with this plan. The Israelites did this. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. That's my favorite Pharaoh quote in the entire book of Exodus, all right? Oh, you lost their services. Well, let's go hire someone else. Okay, no, this was their economy. Slave labor was their economy. They all left, some 2 million of them. He's like, what did we do? We don't have a chance at economic recovery now. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. Now, here's why they were marching out boldly. They had just seen God bring the most powerful nation on earth to its knees. In fact, on their way out, Moses said, go to the homes of your neighbors and ask them for their stuff. They're like, do what? Yeah, go to their homes, knock on their doors, and ask them for their stuff. So on their way out, they have all their possessions, got the kids in tow, got their wagons. They knocked on the doors. The Egyptians opened them and said, hey, we're leaving now. Do you have any stuff you want to give us? And the Egyptians were so eager to see them leave, true story, they said, take our money, take our jewels, take our gold, take our silver, take our camels, whatever, just go, get out of our land. So they plundered the Egyptians, they became exceedingly wealthy, and they didn't even have to lift a finger. They saw these people cowering in fear. They see God delivering them, and they are marching out boldly. Until they catch sight of their old slave masters. Here's what happens. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt. Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Now here's the question. Is that what they actually said when Moses showed up? Actually, we have it on tape. Exodus chapter 4, check this out. This is what actually happened. "And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped." It's not exactly the way they remembered it. What's going on? Why the disconnect? Fear. Fear causes us to have a very distorted view of reality. Fear causes us to not see things the way things actually are in reality. And their fear is completely unreasonable. They're marching out, they see the Egyptians, they fall into panic and terror and fear. That's the most unreasonable thing they could do. And why is it unreasonable? That an enemy army wants to cut them down and they have no fighting men? It's simple. They have just seen God do 10 plagues on the Egyptians. If they had been thinking rationally, they would have said, hold on. We have to make some popcorn because the show's about to start. We're about to see the 11th plague. Will these people never learn? That would have been what a reasonable person would have thought and said. But at the sight of their former slave masters, fear takes over, fear springs to life in their hearts, and their view of reality is completely distorted. This is so true in our lives. Fear distorts our perception of reality. And for many of us, the source of our fear is a master who wants to enslave you. Maybe you are terrified by what people think of your reputation. That slave master of reputation and other people's approval is coming after you, saying, "You must serve me or die." Maybe you're afraid of the future and having enough money to provide for yourself and cover your needs and live how you want to live. And that fear is real in your life and it is distorting your perception of reality. It is the slave master of you thinking you control the outcomes of your life rather than God saying, "Serve me or die." For some of you, it's addiction. And there's a behavior. And it has owned your life. And you try to break free from it, but it keeps coming after you, and it is saying, "Serve me or die." And when you see your former slave master, fear springs to life, and it distorts your view of reality. Where is your fear? What slave master is trying to claim you? That's where the nation is at right now. They are free. They are marching out boldly. They have seen God deliver them, but at the sight of their former slave master, fear takes over. And they blame Moses for being their liberator. Here's what happens. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." Moses is the only one who's calm. Moses, when he sees the old slave masters, doesn't have fear in his heart. He doesn't have slavishness in his heart. He has seen the Lord. He has encountered the Lord. He met the Lord at the burning bush. He has spoken with the Lord. And when he sees the Egyptians coming, there's no fear in his heart. So he says to them, "Guys, get rid of the fear, because today you are going to see something." What are you going to see today? He says, you will see what? Let's go back. You will see the deliverance of the Lord. Now, this is a critical word for understanding what's going to happen next. He doesn't say, today you will see, spoiler alert if you've never heard this story, today you will see the waters of the Red Sea part, okay? Sorry, I just ruined it. He doesn't say you're going to see the waters of the Red Sea part. He doesn't say you're going to see an amazing miracle. He doesn't say you're going to see the power of the Lord and his right arm to destroy his enemies. What does he say? You're going to see the deliverance. Now, this Hebrew word deliverance is the same word as a popular Hebrew Jewish boy's name, and the name was Yeshua. And Yeshua is the Hebrew version of the English name, which is also a popular boy's name, Joshua. Joshua, Yeshua, means deliverance. It means salvation. It means the Lord saves. Now, Joshua also has another popular name in a different language. Yeshua is Joshua, which is also the same name in Greek for Jesus. Moses is saying, do not be afraid. Stand firm, because today you will see not the power, not the miracle, you will see the deliverance, you will see the Joshua, you will see the Jesus of the Lord today. What we are about to see is going to be an incredible picture of who Jesus is. He continues, the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Okay, so they're coming down. Moses, what do we do? What do we do? You just stand there. And this is the ultimate operating principle of how God works and how God saves and how God delivers. You be still. God is going to do all the work. You just watch and see what salvation looks like. You just watch and see how the Lord delivers you and saves you. That's what we're going to see. Now, what happens next is fascinating. Verse 15. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Here's the problem. There is only one person in the Israelite camp who's not crying out. Who is it? Moses. Moses is the only one who's not crying out, but God rebukes Moses. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So Moses is the man of faith. Moses is the man without fear. Moses is the man who says, come on, everybody, don't worry. You're going to see God show up in an amazing and powerful way. And then God speaks to Moses. What are you complaining about? Now, why does God rebuke Moses? All the other people are the ones doing wrong. Why does he rebuke Moses? The reason why is because Moses plays a critical role for the nation of Israel throughout the entire Exodus story. And here's what it is. If you have a program and you're taking notes, you can fill in this blank. Moses gets rebuked because he represents the people before God. These people are so sinful and wicked that if they tried to represent themselves before God, God would just say, I'm done with you. But they have a representative who represents the entire nation of people behind him. Moses is the man. Moses is the one. Moses is the intercessor. He goes before God, and he represents a sinful people to a holy God. So if Moses represents the sinful people, then why does God use Moses to do a miracle? Why does Moses get to display God's power and strength? He represents sinners, and he himself is a sinner. Let us not forget that the Moses story began when he murdered a guy. Here's why. Moses performs a miracle because he represents God to the people. Moses has a job that is much more important than being a leader, than being a guide, or being a president or a king. He's a mediator. He's the man in the middle. And his job is to represent a sinful people to a holy God, and his job is to represent a holy God to a sinful people. And this is the only reason why this nation is blessed. They're no better than the Egyptians. They're no better than any of the peoples around them. They're sinful, they're rebellious, they're hard-hearted. They're always grumbling and complaining, and why did you bring us out of slavery? We had it so much better being slaves in Egypt. The only thing that distinguished these people from any of the nations around them was that they had a mediator, a man in the middle who represented a sinful people before God and took the rebuke they deserved, and who represented a holy God to the people and got to perform the miracle only God can perform. He's the mediator. Now hold on to this thought because, again, today we're seeing the salvation, we're seeing the deliverance, we're seeing the Jesus of the Lord today. We're going to come back to that. Let's continue with the story for now. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Sorry, just things pop in my head. Then Moses stretched out his hand. This is where it gets good. He stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, let me pause and say perhaps the most obvious thing we see in this story today. On the one side, the Israelites are under the sentence of death, with their slave masters bearing down on them. How are they saved? By crossing over. They are delivered from death to life by crossing over the sea. Again, we're going to see Jesus. We're going to come back to this idea in a little bit. Just want you to think about that for now. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. And I wrote in my notes preparing the message this week, I bet they did. And the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. I thought they would have reached this conclusion sooner, to be honest. Maybe somewhere around the plague of locusts or hail, they would have said, this just isn't worth the hassle. Let's let them go. Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Now, the whole purpose of this story is not just to tell us a story and give us a great movie we could watch decade after decade the night before Easter. The purpose of this story is that today we would see the salvation, the deliverance, the Jesus of our Lord. So what do we see in this story? The Israelites are under the sentence of death, and they get out by crossing over. Their job is to be still and see the deliverance. They get out by crossing over. And the principle of grace is so crystal clear here. At one point, every single one of us is or was under the sentence of death. The wages of sin is death. When you sin, something dies, a relationship, your health, your career, and your spiritual life. When you sin, your relationship with God dies. And all of us are under the sentence of death because of sin. Sin is what comes out of the heart, it's what comes out of the mind, it's what comes out of the soul and says, I don't have to obey God's laws, I'll follow my own laws. I don't have to obey God's authority, I'll be my own authority. I don't have to obey God's wisdom, I know what's best for my life, I'm going to do it my way. Sin is rebellion against God. And all of us, because of our own sin, are under a sentence of death, with our old slave masters laying claim over our lives and fear filling our hearts. And the way that we get out is by crossing over from death to life. To become a Christian is not to have a change in your character, although I'm sure your character is going to change. To become a Christian is not primarily to have a change in your behavior, although I'm sure your behavior is going to change. To become a Christian is to have a change in your status and to, in a moment, cross over from death to life. Jesus said in John chapter 5, whoever hears my words and believes my Father has crossed over from death to life, which means in an instant you can be under a sentence of death and through Jesus be brought into God's grace and favor and standing. You can be at one moment liable for every sin you have committed in your life under the sentence of God's judgment, and in a moment cross over to God being pleased with you and delighted to you and rejoicing in you. And it is not because of your behavior or your attitude that changed. It's because you crossed over by faith. That's how the Israelites crossed over, by faith. They trusted the word of the Lord through his mediator. Now, I don't know how they were walking through the Red Sea. I imagine some were walking through the water. I mean, just think of this. Okay, there's a wall of water. That shouldn't happen, and you're walking through it step by step for miles. Some are walking through thinking, we're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die, we're going to die. And others are thinking, this is lit. Wow. Hey, Pharaoh, take the L, buddy. Yeah. How's that L taste, Pharaoh? Is that a whale? Look at that. I don't know how they're walking through. Some are so scared they're going to die. Others have just this big confidence. But some have big faith, some have little faith. Which ones are saved? All of them. Why? Because none of them were saved by the size of their faith. They were saved by the object of their faith, and their object was in the mediator who was representing God to them. You are not saved because your faith is big. You're saved because of who your faith rests in. And to follow Jesus means my faith, my hope, my trust is in Jesus. That when he died on the cross, he died for my sin. He died for my rebellion. He died for my failure, and I am forgiven by him. And when your faith is in him, big or small. Now, it'll change how you enjoy the walk through life. Don't get me wrong. Big faith or little faith will impact that, but it will not impact your standing with God. When your faith is in Christ, you cross over from death to life, and you will not be condemned. You are no longer under the sentence of death, but in the freedom that comes from following Christ. And that's the first big idea we see. Let's fill in this blank. Jesus is the true and better deliverance, who commands you to be still while he frees you from your masters. Who are the masters in your life who are inspiring fear in you? This is important. I want you to take a moment right now where you're sitting. I want you to think about this. Where in life is the fear coming from? Is there any fear in your heart today? Perfect love from God drives out that fear. So what is that fear about? Where is it coming from? What's driving that? It means there is a slave master in your life who is coming after you saying, you serve me or die. Is it the human approval? Is it your reputation? Dude, Jesus killed that slave master. He shouldn't say dude in church, I'm sorry. He killed that slave master. He said, you have my approval. You have God's approval. What are you worried about mortals for? You live for me. We live for an audience of one, and the audience of one delights in us. We have God's approval through faith in Jesus Christ. Is it having enough? God says the righteous will not be forsaken. Your children won't be begging for bread. You'll be fine. God crushes that slave master. He says, if I took care of your eternal destination, you don't think I can get you through life intact? See, fear says God lost control of the universe. It's all going to chaos now. He didn't. And he's freed you from that slave master. What are you afraid of in your heart? That's slavishness in your heart. You need to bring that into the presence of Christ and say, Jesus, you are my master. Help me trust you in this area of my life and give me the freedom that comes from following you. Second thing we see, here's how we see the deliverance of Jesus in this text. Jesus is the true and better mediator who represents us before God. The Israelites got out because they had a mediator. Moses was rebuked for the Israelites' sin, but Jesus didn't just get rebuked for you. Jesus is the mediator of all of us before his Father in heaven. And because of our sin, Jesus didn't just get rebuked. He took God's wrath On the cross, Jesus went there bearing your sin, bearing your shame, bearing your guilt, representing you before a holy God. And on the cross, Jesus was the one who suffered God's wrath, paying for your sins. So that now, through him, God looks at you and says, you are forgiven, you are redeemed, you are holy and precious in my sight. God does not see you according to your past. He sees you through your mediator, and Jesus represents you. And when you delight in him, rejoice in your mediator, and get lost in his beauty, you experience the freedom that comes from having only God as your master. You've got a mediator who is unlike any representative you could have on earth. And he lives to intercede for us, the scriptures say. Which means right now, Jesus is before God, still interceding, saying, hey, Dad, yeah, it's Jason again. Yep, I know. Yes, I know. Again, yes, again. Yeah, we talked about it. Yeah, again. But I want you to know that I covered that, Father. So we're good. He's interceding for you. He's representing you. Here's what we're going to do next. In a minute, I'm going to invite the band out on stage. And they're going to play a song, and the reason why we're going to play this song is so that right here where you're sitting, you can have a moment to yourself to reflect on this, to meditate, to search out your own heart. Where are you afraid? What does it look like in that area of your life to be still and let the Lord fight for you and to trust him and experience the freedom that comes from following him? I'm going to pray and then we're going to do that. Father, thank you that from the beginning you had this beautiful plan of how we would have deliverance from sin through Jesus Christ. And before Jesus even showed up, centuries before Jesus showed up, you still showed us how this deliverance would take place. Thank you for this story, for pouring meaning into such an important idea. Jesus, we thank you that you're a perfect mediator. You bore our sin. You bore our shame. You represented the worst of who we are before God, and you paid the penalty for our sin so that through trusting you, we have crossed over from death to life. We rejoice in that. Make that real in our hearts. When our slave masters come back and demand that we serve them, Lord, give us the courage to stand firm and to be still and to tell them, you are no longer my master. Christ is my master. Jesus, you're the only master who, when we have you, you fill us, and when we fail you, you forgive us. Thank you for your grace. May our trust always and only be in you. Amen.